Minister Lord Goldsmith, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to join this event on nature finance ahead of the Stockholm Plus 50 conference. I'm Deborah Lehr, Vice Chairman and Executive Director of the Paulson Institute. On behalf of our Chairman, Secretary Hank Paulson, we want to thank you for all the good work that you're doing to drive the agenda for protecting nature. People might reasonably ask, why are you talking about biodiversity when there's a war in Ukraine, an energy crisis, a global supply chain crisis, and a looming food security crisis? The answer is, without a healthy planet, the foundation of human civilization, we undermine our ability to tackle all other crises, and the health of our planet is in peril. We're in the midst of one of the greatest extinction events Earth has ever experienced, and the first to be driven by humans. I often hear that we must tackle the climate crisis first, and then we'll tackle biodiversity loss. This would be a mistake, and there's no time to wait. Well-intentioned policies to tackle climate change could, if not well planned, exacerbate biodiversity loss. Think of the footprint of a wind or solar farm, if not placed appropriately, that could destroy the natural habitat. And of course, biodiversity loss weakens our resilience to climate change. We must tackle the climate and biodiversity crises together and in an integrated way, and especially because the statistics about biodiversity loss are terrifying. Populations of vertebrates have declined by a staggering 68% since 1970. 90% of the world's large fish have disappeared. And today, humans, or the livestock on which we depend for food, make up 96% of the biomass of mammals on Earth. This loss is not only desperately sad, it also presents tremendous risks to human prosperity and well-being. These risks fall into two main categories: economic risk and public health risk. First, the economic risks. It's hard to quantify free goods, and that's how we price nature today. And I recognize it's very hard to put a price on nature. Yet it's important we develop some type of benchmarks to demonstrate the extent of the potential challenge. Consider the threat to our already fraught food supply. The loss of pollinators alone, our bees and birds, could lead to a drop in annual agricultural output of more than 200 billion annually. Add in the non-food crops such as alfalfa, the main feed for cattle, and the impact rises to more than 500 billion a year. If we use standard financial valuation techniques to calculate the value of these assets, just like a tiny bee, it has a capital value of close to 14 trillion US dollars. To put that in context, it's equal to almost 75% of the US national income. Deforestation is another major threat to biodiversity. Many of you here are familiar with the recent research that has argued for a value as high as $600 per ton for carbon captured. Based on that estimate, the implied value of our forests for their carbon sequestration role alone is well over $100 trillion. But that's like valuing a microchip based on just its silicon. The value is significantly higher. Roughly half of the global economy, $44 trillion, is dependent on nature or the services it provides. Such estimates are helpful for demonstrating the scale of our reliance, but of course, ultimately, all economic activity depends on our having clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and a habitable climate. Second, the public health risks. There's growing evidence that biodiversity loss puts humans into contact with stressed ecosystems in ways that increase the risk of the transfer of zoonotic diseases. It's no coincidence that during the last few decades of catastrophic biodiversity loss, we've seen outbreaks of zoonotic diseases such as SARS, MERS, Ebola, and of course, COVID. In fact, 75% of emerging diseases in the last century have been transmitted from animals to humans. The International Monetary Fund expects the cost of the current pandemic to the global economy to exceed $12.5 trillion by 2024. We can't continue to maintain those costs. At the same time, nature provides us with about a third of our medicines. For example, the PCR test for COVID, which we're now all too familiar with, was created using heat-resistant enzymes originally found in hot springs in Yellowstone National Park. The last 2 years have been a stark reminder of just how damaging zoonotic diseases can be and how much we rely on nature to protect us. Added to these two risks, it's increasingly clear that our path to net zero carbon relies on a healthy biosphere and nature-based solutions. So if nature is so valuable, why are we not doing a better job protecting it? The fundamental reason is that we don't place an appropriate value on nature in our economies. There is growing evidence, as set out by Professor Dasgupta in his review into the economics of biodiversity, that we should be treating natural capital in the same way we treat other forms of capital, such as built capital, financial capital, and human capital. We should measure it, value it, and invest in it. However, the current inability of our financial systems and valuing nature means that instead we're over-exploiting it, resulting in its depreciation. In 2020, the Paulson Institute, together with our partner, the Nature Conservancy, published a report entitled Financing Nature, Closing the Global Biodiversity Financing Gap. In our report, we showed that there's a $700 billion gap between what the world spends on biodiversity conservation today and what is needed over the next decade. That's a big number, but it's also manageable. To put it in context, it's around 1% of global GDP, but that's actually less than what the whole world spends on soft drinks in just 1 year. There is a path forward, yet it does take political will. Fortunately, we're seeing glimmers of that through the good work that's being done in the United Kingdom in hosting the G7 meetings and COP26, where biodiversity was on the agenda, and by China at the CBD COP. The most enlightening finding from the Financing Nature report is that we can significantly reduce the gap by addressing just two major issues. First, we must stop subsidizing bad behaviors. Consider that annual subsidies for activities that harm biodiversity, such as the $400 billion for dirty energy consumption, are at least twice the annual capital flows towards biodiversity conservation. Here, governments must begin the politically fraught process of diverting public funds away from environmentally harmful activities and towards those that protect and sustainably manage nature. This one step alone could help close the funding gap by up to 1/2. That's with no new money, simply diverting existing funds. Second, we must integrate biodiversity risk management into financial decision-making. It's essential that we steer the trillions of planned public and private sector investments away from projects that do harm to nature towards projects that protect and restore nature. And if we can reform the harmful subsidies and integrate biodiversity risk into investment, we'll go a long way towards closing the global biodiversity financing gap without the need for new money. Even still, public sector funds alone can't cover the costs necessary. Private sector monies are definitely required. It's not an easy task to create financial assets out of birds, bees, and trees. But to realize the potential of private sector investment in nature, government must put in place the right incentives and regulatory frameworks to make it happen. However, recognizing that these changes won't happen overnight, it's vital that we explore sources of new financing or expansion of existing financing for nature. For this audience, I'd like to highlight one, the overseas development assistance. Although its contribution is relatively small, it could have a disproportionate positive impact. This assistance is politically important to developing countries in the UN negotiations and, if used smartly, could help developing countries leverage additional sources of funding and incentivize nature-positive outcomes. Commitments by donor countries to allocate a greater proportion of ODA for nature could be linked to commitments by recipients to build the technical capacity to carry out the necessary policy reforms. Before I close, I'd like to set out a few recommendations that the Paulson Institute believes would make an important difference, but most important are viable options. First, it's important to secure commitments from all countries to develop and implement national biodiversity action and financing plans to create the roadmap towards solutions. Second, we must encourage governments to audit national subsidies, enabling them to identify those most harmful to nature. Redeployment of these funds towards nature-positive subsidies is a low-cost and effective way of reform, as I mentioned earlier. Third, to take steps to align climate and biodiversity finance. Donor countries have committed to reach $100 billion in climate financing, and 3 G7 countries, France, the UK, and Canada, have committed to align 30% of their climate finance for nature-based solutions. If all donor countries did that, it would generate about $25 billion per year to support biodiversity outcomes in developing countries. Fourth, we should reconsider the charters of multi-development banks to include nature financing. Just as multilateral development banks are ensuring their investments are consistent with the Paris Agreement on climate change, they should commit to ensuring their investments are consistent with the Kunming Declaration on Biodiversity and the forthcoming Global Biodiversity Framework due to be approved later this year. And finally, governments should make financing nature an essential part of their economic recovery plans in this post-COVID world. The important work being conducted by the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures and the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge are helping us to understand how. The economic and health arguments for protecting nature are compelling, yet there's an overwhelming case for preserving nature for its own sake. Nature is our greatest source of beauty, inspiration, innovation, and intellectual interest. Indeed, for everything that's good in life. In that sense, it's priceless. I wish you all a successful and productive event today, and I look forward to seeing the outcomes of your discussions. Thank you for including the Paulson Institute.